The rain fell upon London in the autumn of 1847, with a persistence that seemed almost deliberate, as though the heavens themselves sought to wash away the sins of a society that measured worth in whispers and weighed virtue on scales of gossip. In the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair, where crystal chandeliers cast their golden light upon silk gowns and polished marble, the season's newest debutantes curtsied and smiled, each hoping to secure the future that glittered just beyond their gloved fingertips. Yet there were names no longer spoken in those perfumed halls, names that had once echoed through ballrooms with promise, and now existed only as cautionary tales whispered behind painted fans. Lady Eleanor Ashford was such a name, a ghost that haunted the edges of memory, a reminder of how swiftly fortune could turn and how mercilessly society could condemn. 2 years prior, she had been the jewel of the season, her beauty praised in sonnets by lovesick poets, her dance card always full, her future seemingly assured. Her father, the late Lord Ashford, had left his family with an ancient name and dwindling fortune, but Eleanor's charm and grace had promised to restore their standing through an advantageous match. Then came Thomas Whitmore, the handsome son of a wealthy merchant whose family had purchased respectability with their considerable fortune, and Eleanor, young and trusting, had believed his honeyed words of devotion. He had courted her with a persistence that flattered, promised her marriage with a conviction that convinced even her cautious mother, and then, in a moment of weakness born from love and assurance, Eleanor had allowed him liberties that society demanded be reserved for the marriage bed. The promises of a swift wedding had sustained her through her fear, but when Thomas's father arranged a more advantageous match with an earl's daughter, the young man had vanished from Eleanor's life as thoroughly as morning mist beneath the sun. Society, which had once celebrated her, turned upon her with the savage efficiency of wolves upon wounded prey. The whispers became declarations, the speculation became certainty, and Eleanor Ashford became a fallen woman, ruined, unworthy of the drawing rooms she had once graced. Now she lived in exile at Ashford Cottage, the small estate in the countryside that was all that remained of her family's former grandeur, its walls crumbling as surely as their reputation, its gardens overgrown with the weeds of neglect. Her days passed in a grey sameness, tending to her mother, whose health had failed beneath the weight of their disgrace, avoiding the village where eyes followed her with judgment and pity in equal measure, existing in a silence so complete it sometimes felt as though she had ceased to be real at all. She was 23, an age when most young women celebrated their children or anticipated them, but Eleanor lived as one already dead to the world that had once known her name. The shame sat upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak, and though she told herself she had learned to bear its weight, there were moments when the burden felt crushing, when the injustice of it all threatened to break something fundamental within her. Thomas Whitmore had married well, prospered in business, and suffered no consequences for the promises he had broken and the reputation he had destroyed, while Eleanor bore the entire weight of their shared sin, condemned to a half-life of isolation and regret, her future reduced to caring for her dying mother in genteel poverty until time itself rendered her invisible. Duke Alexander Rothwell arrived at Thornfield Manor on a grey October morning, when the mist still clung to the valley like a shroud, his carriage wheels cutting through the silence of the countryside with the authority that seemed almost intrusive in that quiet landscape. He was known throughout England as the Winter Duke, a title bestowed not through affection but through fear, for his demeanour matched the season's coldness with an exactitude that left lesser men uncomfortable in his presence. At 38, he had built an empire upon the foundation of his inheritance, transforming the Rothwell estates from merely prosperous to legendary in their wealth, his investments in railways and industry proving as shrewd as his political manoeuvrings in Parliament, where his speeches, though infrequent, carried the weight of winter frost that could wither opposition before it fully bloomed. He had rejected every matrimonial prospect presented to him for 12 years, declining princesses and heiresses with the same polite indifference one might show to offers of inferior wine, his refusals always courteous but absolute, leaving a trail of wounded pride and speculative gossip in drawing rooms from London to Edinburgh. Society whispered that his heart had frozen, along with his parents, who had perished in a carriage accident when Alexander was but 16, leaving him to shoulder responsibilities that would have crushed a weaker soul, forcing him to become duke and man in a single terrible night, and perhaps something vital had indeed died within him then, leaving only the cold efficiency that made him successful and the emotional distance that made him formidable. He had purchased Thornfield Manor not for its beauty or comfort, but for its proximity to a coal mine in which he held significant interest, intending to use the estate only for occasional business purposes, a base from which to oversee operations without the inconvenience of constant travel from his London residence. The house itself was grand, though it had fallen into some disrepair under its previous owner, but Alexander saw only its utility, not its potential for warmth, much as he viewed most things in his carefully ordered existence. That first afternoon, as he walked the perimeter of his new property with his land agent, reviewing boundaries and discussing improvements that would increase productivity, he glimpsed a figure in the distance, a woman walking along the edge of the neighboring grounds, with a grace that seemed at odds with her worn cloak and the small dog that bounded at her heels. She moved as though she wished to be invisible, her head bowed, her steps quick, and there was something in her posture that spoke of sorrow so deep it had become a permanent companion, a weight she carried with such practiced ease that it had become part of her very bearing. Alexander found his attention drawn to her despite himself, though she was too distant for him to discern her features, and when his agent spoke, he had to ask the man to repeat himself, realizing with some surprise that he had been distracted, a rare occurrence for one whose focus was legendary. He did not ask about the mysterious woman, for such curiosity seemed beneath him. Yet, as he returned to the manor that evening, reviewing contracts and correspondence by lamplight, he found his thoughts returning to that solitary figure, wondering at the story behind such evident melancholy, feeling the faintest stirring of something he could not name in the frozen chambers of his guarded heart. The morning arrived with a crispness that promised winter's approach, the frost clinging to the grass with a determination that would not yield until the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Eleanor walked the familiar path along the boundary of her family's small estate with Pip, her terrier, trotting contentedly at her heels, this daily ritual one of her few remaining pleasures in an existence that offered precious little joy. She had ventured out early, hoping to avoid any chance encounters with villagers who might be traveling the road, her need for solitude having become as essential as breathing, a shield against the constant weight of judgment she felt pressing upon her whenever eyes turned in her direction. Pip suddenly stiffened, his ears pricking forward with an alertness that Eleanor recognized too late, and before she could call him back, he bolted through a gap in the hedgerow, his excited barking growing distant as he pursued some unfortunate rabbit across the neighboring property, and Eleanor's heart sank with a dread that was immediate and visceral, for the new owner of Thornfield Manor was in residence, and the last thing she needed was to trespass upon a duke's land like some common poacher. She gathered her worn cloak more tightly about her and ducked through the same gap, calling softly for Pip, hoping desperately to retrieve him before anyone noticed their intrusion. But as she emerged into the manicured grounds of Thornfield, she saw with horror that her small dog had been captured, held firmly but gently in the hands of a tall man, whose bearing proclaimed his status as clearly as any announcement, and she recognized the Duke of Rothwell from the descriptions she had heard in the village, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his face carved with the kind of stark beauty that came from strong bones and austere living, his eyes the color of winter storms. Eleanor froze, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but Pip wriggled in the Duke's grasp, whining to be released, and she forced herself forward on legs that trembled, dropping into a curtsy that felt awkward after so long without practicing such formalities. "Your Grace, I apologize most profusely for the intrusion," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground before his boots, which were, she noticed, perfectly polished despite the morning's dampness. "The dog is mine, and he escaped my supervision in pursuit of a rabbit." Alexander studied the woman before him with an intensity that was habitual, noting the quality of her cloak despite its obvious age, the way she held herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her evident anxiety, the manner in which she refused to meet his eyes, as though she expected condemnation or worse from any man who might look upon her. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice carrying the cool precision that made lesser men uncomfortable, though he kept his tone deliberately neutral, curious about this mysterious woman who walked his neighbor's grounds like a ghost. "Lady Eleanor Ashford, "Your Grace," she replied, the title sounding strange on her lips after so long in exile, and she finally raised her eyes to his face, just briefly, before dropping them again. And in that fleeting glance, Alexander saw something that struck him unexpectedly, a sadness so profound it seemed to have carved itself into her very features, yet beneath it, a spark of something unbroken, a core of steel that suffering had not managed to destroy. He held out the terrier, and she stepped forward to take him, her hands trembling visibly as they brushed against his own, and he noted the way she flinched at even that innocent contact, as though she expected cruelty from every quarter. "Your dog is spirited," he observed, watching as she clutched the animal to her chest like a shield. "I trust he is unharmed, Your Grace, and I assure you we will not trespass again," Eleanor said quickly, already backing away, desperate to end this encounter before it could become worse, before he could recognize her name and realize precisely what sort of woman stood before him. Alexander frowned slightly, puzzled by her evident distress, wondering what could inspire such fear in response to so minor an incident. "There was no harm done, Lady Eleanor," he said, but she was already retreating, murmuring another apology, and then she turned and fled through the gap in the hedgerow with a haste that spoke of panic rather than mere embarrassment, leaving Alexander standing alone in his garden, holding the memory of her sad eyes and wondering why the encounter had disturbed him far more than it should have, why he found himself already hoping for another meeting with the mysterious woman who bore her sorrow like a crown of thorns. Alexander returned to Thornfield Manor with the name Lady Eleanor Ashford, repeating in his mind like an unanswered question, and though he told himself his curiosity was merely idle, he found himself making inquiries the following morning when his land agent came to discuss drainage improvements, asking in what he hoped was a casual tone about the neighboring property and its inhabitants. The agent, a local man who had served the previous owner, proved remarkably forthcoming once given permission to speak freely, explaining that the Ashford estate had once been prosperous but had fallen into decline after the old lord's death and the scandal that had driven the family into seclusion, and when Alexander pressed for details with a directness that betrayed more interest than he intended, the man shared the story that all the village knew, how Lady Eleanor had been a celebrated beauty during her London season 2 years prior, how a wealthy merchant's son named Thomas Wickham had courted her with apparent devotion, how there had been whispered promises of marriage, and a compromising incident at a country house party that had been witnessed by enough people to make it undeniable, and how Wickham had abandoned her entirely when his family arranged a more advantageous match with a baronet's daughter, leaving Eleanor to bear the full weight of society's condemnation while he went on to marry well and prosper in his father's business ventures. Alexander listened with an expression that revealed nothing, but something cold and sharp twisted in his chest as the agent continued, describing how Lady Eleanor's mother had fallen ill from the shame and stress, how they had retreated to their small estate and lived in virtual isolation, how the daughter was occasionally seen in the village but always alone, always hurrying through her errands as though she feared contamination from human contact, and how the village itself was divided between those who pitied her and those who judged her as a fallen woman who had brought her ruin upon herself through improper behavior. That afternoon, Alexander's solicitor arrived from London with contracts requiring review, and over dinner, the man mentioned having heard that the Duke had encountered Lady Eleanor Ashford, warning, with the careful concern of a long-time retainer, that association with her could prove damaging to his Grace's own reputation, that society had long memories for such scandals, and that it would be wise to maintain a proper distance despite their proximity as neighbors. Alexander dismissed the concern with a coolness that discouraged further comment. But alone that evening in his study, he found himself profoundly disturbed by the profound injustice of Eleanor's situation, the way one man's cowardice and dishonor had destroyed a young woman's entire existence, while he himself suffered no consequences whatsoever, and the thought stirred something in him that he had not felt in many years, a rage that was both hot and cold simultaneously, directed not at Eleanor but at the society that had condemned her while absolving her seducer. He remembered suddenly his own mother, who had been judged harshly by the highest circles for having married his father, a second son with more charm than fortune, how she had endured whispers and cuts direct from women who considered themselves her betters, and though his parents had been devoted to each other until their deaths, His mother had never been fully accepted by the world into which she had married, and perhaps that early lesson in society's cruelty had planted seeds that, now, seeing Eleanor's desperate eyes and fearful demeanor, finally took root in soil long frozen by grief and isolation. Alexander sat long into the night, the contracts forgotten before him, thinking of a woman who walked like a ghost through her own life, and feeling an unexpected kinship with her sorrow, recognizing in her isolation something that mirrored his own self-imposed exile from human warmth, and understanding with a clarity that surprised him that Lady Eleanor Ashford was not a fallen woman, but rather a woman who had been pushed, and that the difference mattered more than society would ever acknowledge. 3 days after their encounter in his garden, Eleanor returned from the village to find her mother's maid waiting at the cottage door with news that sent a jolt of alarm through her chest, the woman explaining in hurried whispers that a physician had arrived unannounced, sent by the Duke of Rothwell to attend Lady Ashford, and Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse this charity, to send the man away with polite but firm insistence that they required no assistance. But when she entered her mother's chamber and saw the doctor already examining her with gentle competence, saw the hope flickering in her mother's weary eyes, she found she could not be so cruel as to deny help that was so desperately needed, regardless of how it wounded her pride to accept it. The physician, a serious man from London with kind eyes and careful hands, prescribed medications and treatments that Eleanor knew they could never afford, and when she tried to discuss payment, he informed her with professional discretion that the Duke had already made arrangements for all expenses, that His Grace had requested the doctor attend Lady Ashford as a matter of community relations, ensuring the health of his neighbours, and Eleanor stood there feeling the familiar burn of humiliation, even as gratitude warred within her breast, hating that she must be grateful, hating more that she had no choice but to accept. 2 days later, once she had ensured her mother was resting comfortably and the new medications were showing promising effects, Eleanor forced herself to walk to Thornfield Manor, her steps heavy with the weight of obligation and the sick dread that always accompanied any interaction that might result in judgment or condemnation. And when the butler admitted her to the Duke's library, she found Alexander seated behind a massive desk covered with correspondence and ledgers, his dark head bent over his work, and for a moment before he noticed her presence, she observed him unguarded, noting the tension in his shoulders and the stern set of his mouth, the loneliness that seemed to emanate from him like winter cold. He rose immediately upon seeing her, his expression shifting to that careful neutrality she was beginning to recognize as his habitual mask, and Eleanor dropped into a curtsy before speaking the words she had rehearsed during the long walk. "Your Grace, I have come to express my gratitude for your extraordinary kindness to my mother," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, which she kept clasped tightly before her. "The physician you sent has already helped her considerably, and we are deeply in your debt." Alexander dismissed her thanks with a slight gesture, his tone as cool as autumn rain when he replied, "It was merely practical, Lady Eleanor, nothing that requires such formal appreciation. I prefer my neighbours to be in good health rather than suffering from treatable ailments." But even as he spoke with such apparent indifference, his eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she saw him noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the thinness of her frame that spoke of meals skipped to ensure her mother had proper nourishment, the exhaustion that had carved itself into her features over 2 years of carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. "How does your mother fare?" he asked, and something in his voice had shifted, grown warmer, almost gentle, as though the question came from genuine concern rather than mere politeness. And Eleanor found herself answering with more honesty than she intended, describing her mother's improvement and her own cautious hope that perhaps the worst might be passing, and for a few moments they spoke of illness and recovery and the challenges of caring for a loved one, and Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stirring within her chest, something that felt dangerously like connection, like the possibility that this austere man might understand the isolation of her existence because he lived in his own form of exile, and the sensation both terrified and comforted her in equal measure. But then she remembered herself, remembered what she was and what he was, and the vast gulf that separated them, and she retreated behind her own careful walls, thanking him once more before fleeing his presence, feeling his eyes upon her back as she departed, and wondering why the Winter Duke seemed to see her with such intensity when everyone else had long since looked away. Weeks passed like water flowing beneath ice, cold and relentless, and Eleanor found herself caught in a bewildering dance she had never agreed to join, for the Duke of Rothwell seemed to materialize wherever she walked, his appearances too frequent to be coincidental, yet presented with such casual indifference that she could not quite accuse him of deliberate pursuit. He would be riding along the lane when she returned from the village, reining in his horse to inquire politely about her mother's health, or she would encounter him walking the border between their properties, claiming to be surveying his land, engaging her in brief conversations about the weather or the state of the roads, before departing with a slight bow that left her more confused than before. The most troubling incident came when he sent a note suggesting that her mother might benefit from the warmth and humidity of his estate's greenhouse, that the exotic plants his previous owner had cultivated might provide therapeutic air for her breathing difficulties. And though Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse this too generous offer, her mother's physician agreed it would indeed be beneficial, and so she found herself escorting Lady Ashford to Thornfield Manor 3 times weekly, sitting on wrought-iron benches, surrounded by ferns and orchids, while the Duke occasionally joined them, speaking of his travels abroad and the gardens he had seen, his manner always courteous, always distant, yet his eyes following Eleanor with an attention that made her skin feel too warm. Then came the books, delivered by a footman with a card stating merely that His Grace had finished these volumes and thought Lady Eleanor might enjoy them, and she opened the packages to find novels she had longed to read but could never afford, poetry collections, even a treatise on watercolor techniques that suggested he had somehow learned of her abandoned artistic pursuits, and with each gift her confusion deepened into something more dangerous, something that felt treacherously like hope. The village noticed, of course, for nothing occurred in their small community without observation and commentary, and Eleanor began to sense the weight of new speculation, heard whispers that cut off abruptly when she approached, saw knowing looks exchanged between the shopkeeper's wife and the vicar's sister, and the attention made her want to crawl out of her skin, made her remember with visceral clarity how scrutiny had destroyed her once before. The tension built in her chest like a storm, gathering strength until finally, on an afternoon when she encountered the Duke yet again during her walk, when he fell into step beside her with that same careful courtesy, Eleanor stopped abruptly on the path and turned to face him with her heart hammering against her ribs and fear making her voice sharp. "Your Grace, I must ask you to speak plainly," she said, lifting her chin though her hands trembled where she gripped her shawl. "What are your intentions toward me? Are you amusing yourself at my expense, or do you perhaps expect certain favors in exchange for your kindness to my mother?" The words came out harsher than she intended, born of 2 years of learning that nothing came without a price, that kindness toward ruined women always had conditions attached, and she watched his face carefully, waiting for the mask to drop, for the proposition she was certain must come. But what she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat, for Alexander's expression shifted from polite neutrality to something raw and wounded, shock flashing across his features as though she had struck him physically, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with an emotion she could not name. "You think I would? Lady Eleanor, I assure you I have no such dishonorable intentions," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, the Winter Duke's careful control cracked just enough to reveal something human beneath, something that looked almost like hurt, and Eleanor felt sudden shame mixing with her fear, uncertain now whether she had protected herself or merely wounded someone who had shown her nothing but unexpected kindness. That evening, Alexander stood alone in his library long after darkness had fallen, staring into the fire without truly seeing the flames, his mind replaying Eleanor's words with the precision of a man who had built his fortune on remembering every detail of every negotiation. And what disturbed him most was not her accusation itself, but the weary resignation in her voice when she made it, as though she had been expecting such dishonor all along, as though kindness shown to her must inevitably conceal ulterior motives, and he found himself wondering what his mother would think of him now, whether she would recognize the cold creature he had become after her death, a man so armored against feeling that an honest gesture of compassion could be mistaken for manipulation. He moved to his desk and withdrew a sheet of paper, intending to write Eleanor a letter of explanation, but the words would not come, for how could he explain what he barely understood himself, this strange compulsion that drew him to seek her out, to find excuses to be near her, to watch the way sunlight caught in her hair during those greenhouse visits, or to notice how her eyes softened when she looked at her mother. And as he sat there with his pen hovering uselessly above blank paper, Alexander was forced to confront a truth he had been avoiding for weeks, the realization settling over him with the weight of inevitability that his interest in Eleanor Ashford had evolved far beyond curiosity or sympathy into something he had sworn never to feel again, something dangerous and consuming that made his chest ache when he thought of her frightened eyes, asking if he meant to use her. He loved her. He understood with sudden crystalline clarity, loved her courage in the face of society's cruelty, loved her dignity despite having every reason to be bitter, loved the way she had rebuilt a life from ruins and cared for her mother with tireless devotion, loved her wariness because it spoke of intelligence rather than naivety, and the recognition of this love brought not joy but a cold dread, for he saw with equal clarity that his attention had brought her nothing but increased scrutiny and pain, that the village gossip he had dismissed as inconsequential was to her a return to the nightmare of public judgment, and he, in his arrogant assumption that his position could protect her, had instead made her a target once more. The next morning, Alexander gave orders to his household that he would be traveling to London on business, that he would not be returning for some weeks, and though his butler looked surprised at this sudden departure, no questions were asked, and Alexander rode away from Thornfield Manor without allowing himself to look toward the small cottage where Eleanor lived, knowing that if he saw her, he might not have the strength to do what honor demanded, which was to remove himself from her life before he caused her further harm. The withdrawal was absolute and immediate. No more chance encounters on walking paths, no more books delivered, no more invitations to the greenhouse, and Eleanor, returning home after 3 days had passed without any sign of the Duke, told herself firmly that she was relieved, that his absence proved she had been right to question his motives, that a man of his station had no genuine interest in a ruined woman beyond whatever amusement or advantage he might gain, yet the hollow feeling in her chest suggested her heart had not received this rational message, and when her mother, whose health had indeed improved remarkably thanks to the treatments the Duke had provided, commented gently that his Grace had seemed a kind man despite his fearsome reputation, Eleanor found herself confessing in a voice barely above a whisper that she had accused him of dishonorable intentions and driven him away, and her mother's sad understanding, the way she took Eleanor's hand and said nothing because what comfort could words provide, only made the ache sharper. As autumn advanced and the Duke's absence stretched from days into weeks, Eleanor discovered that loneliness could be measured in degrees, that the isolation she had endured for 2 years had been bearable in its constancy. But this new solitude, sharpened by the brief glimpse of connection she had experienced, cut deeper than anything she had known before, and she caught herself listening for hoofbeats on the lane, watching for a tall figure in the distance, hoping despite all reason that perhaps she had been wrong, that perhaps his kindness had been genuine after all. But the Duke of Rothwell did not return, and Eleanor was left to acknowledge, only to herself in the darkness of sleepless nights, that somewhere in those few weeks of careful conversations and unexpected gestures, she had allowed herself to hope for something she had believed forever lost, and the return to hopelessness was a grief all its own. The frost came early that October, settling over the countryside like a shroud, and with it came news that made Eleanor's blood run cold, for word spread through the village that Mr. Christopher Hartley, the merchant's son who had destroyed her life 2 years prior, had purchased property in the neighboring parish and would be taking up residence with his wife and young family before the month's end. And Eleanor felt the walls of her small world closing in with suffocating finality, knowing that she could not bear to encounter him regularly, could not endure the sight of his domestic happiness built upon the ruins of her reputation, and could not survive the casual cruelty she knew would come whenever their paths crossed. She tried to convince herself that perhaps he would not recognize her, that perhaps he would have the decency to avoid her, but such hopes were shattered on a grey Thursday afternoon when she ventured into the village to purchase thread and writing paper, necessities she could not avoid, despite her dread of public spaces, and as she stood at the draper's counter counting out her carefully hoarded coins, she heard a voice behind her that sent ice through her veins, that familiar jovial tone saying, "Good heavens, can it truly be Eleanor Ashford?" How extraordinary to find you still lingering in this dreary little corner of England." She turned slowly, her packages clutched against her chest like a shield, and to find Christopher Hartley regarding her with an expression of amused condescension. His expensive coat and polished boots, a stark contrast to her faded cloak, his wedding ring catching the light as he gestured carelessly, and when she did not respond, frozen by the shock of confronting him after 2 years of haunted memory, he stepped closer and continued in a voice pitched to carry across the shop, "I had wondered what became of you after that unfortunate business in London. Tell me, have you been well? Have you found any gentleman willing to overlook your, shall we say, damaged circumstances?" The cruelty was deliberate, the reference to their past intimacy unmistakable, and Eleanor felt rather than saw the other customers in the shop turning to stare, felt the weight of their judgment settling upon her shoulders once more, and when she tried to speak, to defend herself or simply to flee, no words would come, her throat closing against the humiliation as Christopher continued with false sympathy. "Of course, I married quite advantageously, as you may have heard. My wife is the daughter of Sir Edmund Fairfax, a considerable fortune and impeccable breeding. We have 2 children now, a third expected in spring. Life has been remarkably kind to me." Before Eleanor could force her paralyzed limbs to move, before she could escape this nightmare made flesh, an older woman near the counter, Mrs. Blackwood, the vicar's widow who had always been among Eleanor's harshest critics, spoke loudly enough for all to hear. Shameless, absolutely shameless, showing her face in decent society as though she has any right to stand among respectable women, and the condemnation, coming after Christopher's public reminder of her ruin, shattered the last of Eleanor's composure, and she fled the shop without her purchases, half blind with tears, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones as she ran toward home, toward the only sanctuary she had left. That evening, sitting beside her mother's bed with trembling hands and a heart that felt as though it might crack open entirely, Eleanor made a decision born of desperation and the certain knowledge that she could not survive if she remained, telling her mother in a voice that shook despite her attempts at calm that they must leave, that she would seek a position as governess abroad, perhaps in France or Italy where no one knew her shame, where she might build some semblance of a life away from the endless judgment and the casual cruelty of those who had once been her peers. And though her mother's eyes filled with tears, though Lady Ashford reached for Eleanor's hand with fingers that had grown stronger, thanks to the treatments the absent Duke had provided, she did not argue, and understanding with the wisdom of a woman who had also suffered society's censure that sometimes survival required flight, and together they agreed that within a fortnight they would depart England forever, leaving behind the cottage that had been both prison and refuge, abandoning the last remnants of the life Eleanor had once known. And as Eleanor lay sleepless that night, she told herself that this ending was inevitable, that she had been foolish to imagine any other future was possible. Yet some traitorous part of her heart whispered that she had hoped, briefly and against all reason, that perhaps the Winter Duke's unexpected kindness had meant something more than charity, and the loss of that impossible dream hurt almost as much as the shame of Christopher Hartley's public cruelty. The news reached Alexander 3 days after Eleanor's encounter in the village, delivered by his housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, who had it from her sister who kept house for the vicar, and the telling came with hesitant concern, for the staff had noted their master's interest in the lady from the cottage, and worried how he might receive word that Mr. Christopher Hartley, whose name Mrs. Davies spoke with particular distaste, had publicly humiliated Miss Ashford in the draper's shop, referencing their past connection with deliberate cruelty, while his wife shopped obliviously in the next aisle, and that Miss Ashford had fled in tears, and worse still, that she and her mother were making preparations to leave England entirely within the fortnight, seeking positions abroad where the weight of scandal might not follow. Alexander listened to this recitation standing perfectly still beside his desk, his expression betraying nothing of the cold fury that ignited in his chest at the image of Eleanor subjected once more to public shame, nor the terror that seized him at the knowledge that she planned to disappear across the Channel where he might never find her again. And when Mrs. Davies finished speaking, clearly expecting some response, he merely thanked her with mechanical courtesy and dismissed her, waiting until the door closed before his control fractured, and he brought his fist down upon the desk with enough force to send papers scattering and an inkwell toppling. His rage at Christopher Hartley was ice rather than fire, the calculated coldness of a man who had built an empire on the precise application of power, and Alexander found himself already planning the systematic destruction of Hartley's business interests, the quiet word to creditors, the withdrawal of investments, the social cuts that would leave the merchant's son understanding too late what it meant to earn the enmity of the Duke of Rothwell. But even as these thoughts crystallized with ruthless clarity, Alexander recognized that revenge against Hartley, however satisfying, was secondary to the greater crisis, which was that Eleanor would be gone in a fortnight, and he had spent 3 weeks hiding in London like a coward, convincing himself that his absence was noble, when in truth it was merely fear wearing the mask of honor. That night, sleepless in his London townhouse while rain lashed against the windows, Alexander paced his study and forced himself to confront what he had been avoiding since that afternoon in his library, when Eleanor had asked his intentions with such weary resignation, the truth settling over him with the weight of inevitability that somewhere between their first meeting, when she had stood on his property apologizing for her dog's trespass, and their last conversation when she had accused him of seeking to use her, he had fallen utterly and irretrievably in love with Eleanor Ashford, loved her not despite the scandal that had marked her, but because of the courage and dignity with which she had endured it, loved her devotion to her mother and the quiet grace she maintained, even when society offered her nothing but judgment, loved the flashes of spirit he glimpsed beneath her careful guardedness, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she had rebuilt a life from ruins without bitterness or complaint, and the recognition of this love brought not the joy he might have expected, but a stark terror, for he understood that he had wasted precious weeks in cowardice while she suffered alone, and now she planned to leave, to vanish into the vast anonymity of the continent, and he would lose forever the only woman who had ever made him feel truly alive. As dawn broke pale and cold over London, Alexander made his decision with the same absolute certainty he brought to every venture that mattered. Understanding that what he contemplated would shock England, he would provide fodder for gossips for years to come, would challenge every convention of his class, but none of that mattered against the simple fact that he loved Eleanor Ashford and would not, could not, let her disappear believing herself unworthy of happiness, and if society condemned him for choosing her, then society could be damned, for he had spent 12 years being the Winter Duke, cold and controlled and utterly alone, and he would not spend another day that way, not when the alternative was Eleanor. And so he called for his carriage before the sun had fully risen, gave orders that sent his household into flurried activity, and set out for the countryside with his heart pounding and his future balanced on the edge of a knife, knowing only that he must reach her before she left and must find the words to make her understand that her scandal meant nothing to him except as evidence of her survival, and that he was prepared to do something that would either redeem them both or destroy his reputation entirely. And in that moment, facing the prospect of public ruin for the sake of private happiness, Alexander discovered that he did not care in the slightest what the cost might be. Alexander's carriage arrived in the village just as the church bells struck noon, and he emerged onto the cobblestones with such purposeful intensity that pedestrians stepped aside instinctively, recognizing the Winter Duke, even if they had never seen him in person, for there was something in his bearing that commanded attention, and when he inquired after Miss Ashford at the posting inn, he was directed toward the market square with the information that she had been seen entering the draper's shop not 10 minutes prior. And so Alexander made his way through the narrow streets with his heart hammering against his ribs in a most unfamiliar manner, only to hear before he rounded the final corner a woman's voice raised in righteous indignation, carrying clearly across the square with words that made his blood run cold. "How dare you show your face among decent women? How dare you stand in this shop as though you have any right to be served alongside respectable matrons? Have you no shame whatsoever? Miss Ashford, or should I say the woman who was once Miss Ashford, before she threw away her virtue and her family's good name." Alexander quickened his pace and emerged into the market square to see a scene that would be seared into his memory forever. Eleanor standing frozen before the draper's shop, with her market basket clutched white-knuckled against her chest, her face drained of all color, while a fashionably dressed woman who could only be Mrs. Christopher Hartley stood barely 3 feet away, pointing at Eleanor with theatrical outrage as a crowd gathered with the horrible fascination that witnesses a public execution, and Eleanor seemed unable to move or speak, merely stood trembling as the condemnation washed over her. and Alexander felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of her suffering, at the injustice of this woman who had never known struggle, condemning Eleanor, who had survived what would have broken lesser souls. His arrival caused a ripple through the crowd, whispers of the Duke and Rothwell, spreading outward like stones dropped in still water, and when Christopher Hartley himself pushed forward with an expression of false bonhomie, clearly not yet understanding the danger he faced, extending his hand and saying with forced joviality, "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure to find you in our humble village. I trust you are finding the neighborhood to your liking." Alexander did not take the offered hand, did not acknowledge the greeting, but instead moved past Hartley as though he did not exist and went directly to Eleanor, positioning himself between her and Mrs. Hartley with deliberate protection, and when he turned to face the crowd, his expression was the cold mask that had earned him his reputation. The Winter Duke, in full Arctic fury, and the square fell silent, with an almost audible snap of attention, for everyone present sensed that something momentous was about to occur, that the careful social order they had always known was balanced on the edge of transformation, and Eleanor, still frozen behind him, felt through her shock and humiliation a flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been terror, for she could not imagine what the Duke intended, could not understand why he had come or what he might do, knew only that for the first time since Christopher Hartley had spoken her name in the draper's shop 3 days prior, she was not alone in her shame. Alexander's voice, when he spoke, carried across the market square with the same cold authority he used in Parliament when ending careers with a single speech, and he addressed not Christopher Hartley directly but rather the assembled crowd, speaking as though reciting facts for a legal proceeding, his tone devoid of emotion but weighted with absolute certainty as he said, "I find it remarkable that Mrs. Hartley should speak of shame and virtue when her husband's own conduct provides such an instructive contrast to these principles." And the crowd shifted uncomfortably, for they recognized the danger in the Duke's measured words, and Alexander continued without pause. "Mr. Christopher Hartley, 2 years ago, deliberately courted Miss Eleanor Ashford with promises of marriage, secured her affections through calculated deception, compromised her reputation in a manner that he knew would make her unmarriageable to others, and then when his family arranged a more financially advantageous match, abandoned her without word or explanation, allowing her to bear alone the full social consequences of his actions while he proceeded to a comfortable marriage and prosperous life. And each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition and discomfort among the witnesses who had perhaps heard rumors but never had the facts laid bare with such devastating clarity. Christopher Hartley's face flushed dark red, and he sputtered, "This is slander, Your Grace. I will have my solicitors contact yours immediately. You cannot make such accusations in public without consequence." But Alexander turned to him with an expression of such Arctic contempt that Hartley took an involuntary step backward, and the Duke responded in that same measured tone. "I welcome legal action, Mr. Hartley, for my solicitors are quite excellent and would be delighted to present evidence in court, including correspondence between you and Miss Ashford, testimony from servants who witnessed your courtship, and a detailed accounting of how you disappeared to London the very week your family's arrangement with the Miller shipping family was finalized. But perhaps more interesting would be the testimony regarding your subsequent boasts to friends about your conquest, which several gentlemen of my acquaintance recall with distaste. So please do proceed with your lawsuit. I assure you it will be most illuminating." The crowd murmured now with shifting allegiances, for they were witnessing not merely a defense but an execution, the systematic dismantling of Christopher Hartley's carefully maintained respectability. And Mrs. Hartley had gone pale and silent, recognizing too late that she had chosen her target poorly, and her husband's bluster collapsed into sputtering denials that convinced no one, and Alexander continued relentlessly. "What I find most remarkable is not that a young man made a selfish choice, for young men are often selfish, but rather that this same man has allowed a woman to suffer years of social exile for consequences that were entirely his creation, has never once attempted to correct the public record or defend her honor, and now has the extraordinary audacity to allow his wife to publicly condemn Miss Ashford, while he stands by as though he bears no responsibility whatsoever. This is not merely dishonor, Mr. Hartley. It is cowardice of the most contemptible variety." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Eleanor's quiet sob behind him, and Alexander turned from Christopher Hartley, who stood now exposed and diminished before the assembled village, dismissed him as utterly as one might dismiss a servant caught stealing, and faced instead Eleanor, who stood trembling with her market basket fallen at her feet and tears streaming down her face. And in her eyes Alexander saw fear and disbelief and something else, something fragile and desperate that might have been hope. And he knew with crystalline certainty that this moment would define both their futures, that what he did next would either redeem them both or prove that his courage had limits after all. And he found that his hands were steady and his heart was sure as he prepared to do something that would shock every witness present and reverberate through English society for years to come. Alexander lowered himself to one knee in the dirt of the village square, and the crowd's collective gasp seemed to steal all the air from the world, for never in living memory had the Duke of Rothwell knelt before anyone, and certainly never in so public a manner, and he looked up at Eleanor with an expression that stripped away every layer of the Winter Duke's famous coldness, revealing instead a vulnerability that made several women in the crowd press handkerchiefs to their mouths, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the square with perfect clarity, formal and steady, despite the enormity of what he was about to do. "Miss Eleanor Ashford, I have known you only a short time, yet in these weeks I have come to recognize in you a strength of character that surpasses any I have encountered in all my years, a dignity in the face of unjust suffering, a devotion to those you love that asks nothing for yourself, and a courage that has survived what would have broken lesser souls. And I find myself compelled to ask if you would do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me the privilege of spending my days ensuring you never again know loneliness or shame, of building with me a life where the past's injustices are transformed into future joy." Eleanor could not breathe, could not move. They could only stare down at this man, who had defended her when no one else would, who knelt now in the dirt before witnesses who would carry this story across all England. And she searched his face desperately for any sign of mockery or pity, for she could not believe that such happiness could be real, that the Winter Duke himself was offering her not merely rescue but genuine devotion, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart crack open, for there was no calculation there, no condescension, only unwavering sincerity and something tender and uncertain, a fear that perhaps she would refuse him, that perhaps even his public declaration would not be enough to convince her that this was real. She tried to speak but could not force sound past the tears that choked her throat, and Alexander remained perfectly still on his knee, waiting with a patience that belied the tension in his shoulders, and finally Eleanor managed a whispered "yes" that barely carried beyond the first row of witnesses, and seeing that he had not heard, seeing the question in his eyes, she gathered every particle of courage she possessed and said again, louder this time, her voice breaking but clear, "Yes, Your Grace, yes, I will marry you." And the words seemed to echo across the square as Alexander rose in one fluid motion, his face transformed by a smile that few had ever seen, and that made several older women recall that he had once been a laughing boy before grief had frozen him. And he took Eleanor's trembling hand in both of his own, with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation entirely, and the crowd erupted in a chaos of shocked exclamations and frantic whispers, for they had witnessed something that would be spoken of for generations, the moment when the coldest duke in England knelt in public to propose to the woman society had condemned as ruined, and Eleanor stood there with tears streaming freely down her face, hardly daring to believe that her exile had ended, that she was no longer alone, that this man who could have had anyone had chosen her. Alexander stood still for a moment, with Eleanor's hand held in his, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon them and the whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, and then he turned to face the assembled villagers with an expression that transformed instantly from tender vulnerability to the cold authority that had made him feared throughout England, and his voice when he spoke carried a warning that none present could mistake. "Miss Ashford has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal, and she will therefore become the Duchess of Rothwell, and I trust that every person here understands what that means, for I am not a forgiving man and I have a long memory, and any word spoken against my future Duchess, any slight however small, any whisper of scandal or judgment, will be met with the full weight of my considerable resources and influence. I will know of it, and I will respond to it. This is not a threat, but simply a statement of fact." The crowd shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, and several people who had been most vocal in their condemnation of Eleanor over the years found sudden fascination with the ground at their feet, and Christopher Hartley and his wife had already disappeared into the dispersing crowd, recognizing that their power to harm had been utterly destroyed in the space of minutes, and Alexander offered his arm to Eleanor with a gentleness that contradicted entirely the steel in his voice moments before, and said quietly for her ears alone, "Come, let me take you home." And she placed her trembling hand on his arm and allowed him to escort her through the parting crowd toward her mother's cottage, her market basket forgotten in the dirt behind them. The walk to the cottage passed in a blur for Eleanor, who moved as though in a dream, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare of the past 2 years had ended so suddenly, so completely, and Alexander's presence beside her was solid and real, and yet somehow impossible. And when they reached the cottage door, he paused and asked with unexpected hesitancy, "May I come in, or would you prefer time alone to consider what has happened?" And Eleanor found herself almost laughing at the absurdity of such formality after what had just occurred, and she managed to say, "Please, come in. My mother will want to meet you properly, and I think perhaps we should speak." Inside the cottage's small sitting room, with its worn furniture and faded curtains that spoke of genteel poverty, they faced each other truly for the first time as betrothed rather than as wary acquaintances, and Eleanor's mother had been resting upstairs, but the commotion brought her down, and her joy upon learning the news was so profound that she wept and embraced Alexander as though he were already her son. And then, with the tact born of understanding, she claimed fatigue and retreated upstairs, leaving them alone in the gathering afternoon light. Eleanor stood by the window, twisting her hands together, and finally she turned to Alexander and asked the question that burned in her chest. "Why, Your Grace? I must understand why you would do this, why you would attach yourself to scandal, why you would risk your reputation for someone like me." And her voice broke on the last words because she could not yet believe that she deserved such devotion. And Alexander crossed the small room in 3 strides and stood before her with an intensity that took her breath away, and he said carefully, as though choosing each word with precision, "I will tell you the truth, Eleanor, though it reveals me as perhaps less noble than my public declaration suggested, for I began with pity when I learned your story. I confess that freely I was moved by the injustice of your situation and my own memories of how society judged my mother for marrying my father, who was considered beneath her, but pity transformed into admiration as I came to know your strength and your grace under burdens that would have crushed others. And admiration became something deeper, something I had not felt in all my 34 years, and somewhere in these past weeks I lost my heart entirely to a woman who tends her mother with devotion, who faces cruelty with dignity, who survived abandonment without becoming bitter, and I find myself terrified that even after today's declaration you will not believe that I love you, truly love you, not from pity or duty, but from genuine recognition that you are the finest person I have known." Eleanor stared at him through fresh tears and whispered, "I thought myself beyond such happiness. I thought that part of my life was finished forever." And Alexander raised his hand slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, and when she did not move, he touched her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and his thumb brushed away her tears as he said, "You deserve every happiness, Eleanor, and I intend to spend my life ensuring you have it." And she closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, feeling safe for the first time in 2 years, feeling the heavy weight of shame finally beginning to lift, and when she opened her eyes again, she saw in his face not pity or obligation, but genuine love, and something like wonder, as though he could not quite believe his fortune in finding her. And in that moment, Eleanor began to believe that perhaps her story was not ending in disgrace after all, but rather beginning anew in unexpected joy. The news spread across England with the speed that only truly scandalous information can achieve, carried by express riders and gossiping servants and shocked correspondents, and within 3 days of Alexander's public proposal, every drawing room in London buzzed with the astonishing intelligence that the Duke of Rothwell, the Winter Duke himself, who had rejected the hand of a Russian princess and turned away the daughters of 3 earls, had become engaged to a ruined woman from the countryside, a fallen lady whose name had been spoken only in whispers of cautionary disapproval for the past 2 years, and the reactions ranged from outraged condemnation to fascinated curiosity to something like gratitude from those who had themselves been judged harshly by society's merciless standards. Letters began arriving at Eleanor's cottage in unprecedented numbers, delivered by riders who seemed bemused to be bringing ducal correspondence to such a modest address, and Eleanor opened them with trembling hands while her mother watched anxiously from her chair by the window, and some letters contained exactly the venom Eleanor had expected. Anonymous notes calling her a scheming fortune hunter who had trapped a great man, accusations that she must have used dark arts or feminine wiles to ensnare the Duke, warnings that she would be shunned by every respectable household in England, and these letters made Eleanor's stomach clench with familiar shame and the terrible fear that perhaps she was indeed becoming a burden to Alexander's reputation, that perhaps his impulsive proposal made in the heat of protective anger would come to be something he regretted. But other letters surprised her with their tone of curiosity rather than condemnation, society matrons writing to request the details of how such an unlikely match had come about, and still others moved her to tears with their expressions of hope and gratitude. Letters from other women who had been cast out by society's judgment, who wrote that seeing the powerful Duke of Rothwell choose love over convention gave them courage to believe that perhaps their own stories need not end in permanent exile, and one letter from a baronet's daughter, currently living in disgrace after being abandoned by her betrothed, included the simple line, "You have given us all permission to hope again," and Eleanor clutched this letter to her chest and wept because she had not imagined that her private joy might become a beacon for others suffering similar injustice. Alexander arrived each morning and stayed until evening, despite the impropriety of such constant attendance before their wedding. And when Eleanor voiced her fear that she was damaging his standing, that perhaps the scandal was too great and he should reconsider before it was too late, he looked at her with such genuine bewilderment that she almost laughed, and he said with the cold precision he typically reserved for business negotiations, "Eleanor, I have spent 12 years cultivating a reputation for not caring what society thinks, and I assure you that reputation is entirely accurate. The opinion of people who would condemn you for suffering another's cruelty is worth less than nothing to me. And if every door in London closes to us, I will count it no loss whatsoever." And his absolute indifference to social consequences was so complete that Eleanor began to believe him, began to understand that his proposal had not been impulse, but rather the action of a man who had calculated all costs and found them irrelevant compared to what he stood to gain. Eleanor's mother recovered enough strength to sit up for hours at a time, and her joy at her daughter's engagement was tempered only by her worry that Eleanor was accepting too quickly that perhaps she should take time to be certain. And Eleanor knelt beside her mother's chair and explained that she had never been more certain of anything, that Alexander had proven himself in ways that left no room for doubt. And her mother touched Eleanor's face with a trembling hand and said, "Then I am content, for I will die knowing you are safe and loved." And Eleanor insisted fiercely that her mother would live to see grandchildren and many happy years, and they both wept and laughed together in the cottage that had been their prison but would soon be only a memory. The wedding was planned for a month hence, a modest ceremony that Alexander arranged with surprising efficiency, and Eleanor found herself learning to accept that this happiness was real, that she deserved it, that her story was not ending in shame, but rather beginning again in unexpected grace. The weeks between betrothal and wedding became for Eleanor a time of careful discovery and gentle transformation. As Alexander arrived each morning at the cottage with an intentionality that spoke of courtship rather than mere duty to a woman already promised to him, and she realized with growing wonder that he was learning her as though she were a book he wished to read thoroughly, asking questions about her preferences and her past that no one had bothered to ask in years, and when she mentioned offhandedly that she had once loved wild roses more than the cultivated varieties because they grew with such fierce determination in unlikely places, he arrived the next day with an armful of them gathered from the hedgerows, and she understood that he heard not just her words, but the meanings beneath them. He discovered her abandoned watercolors tucked away in a trunk, the paints dried and the brushes stiff from 2 years of neglect, and rather than simply replacing them, he sat with her and asked about each painting, listening as she explained the scenes she had captured before her world collapsed, and his genuine interest in her artistic eye moved her nearly to tears. And within days new supplies arrived from London, the finest quality, and Alexander suggested quietly that perhaps she might paint again if it brought her joy. And Eleanor found herself standing before a blank canvas for the first time in 2 years, trembling with the fear that she had lost whatever small talent she once possessed. But when she finally put brush to paper, the familiar pleasure flooded back, and she painted wild roses. She learned him in turn during those golden weeks of courtship, discovering that his legendary coldness was indeed protective ice over depths of feeling he had learned to hide when his parents died, and the world demanded he become a man at 16, and he admitted one afternoon, while they walked through the woods, that he had felt half alive for years, going through the motions of business and duty, while some essential part of himself remained frozen, and meeting her had been like the first thaw of spring after an endless winter. And the vulnerability in his confession made Eleanor reach for his hand without thinking, and their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had held hands 1,000 times before. The small moments of intimacy accumulated like falling snow, each one delicate but together creating something substantial and transformative, and they read together in her mother's sitting room, with Eleanor's shoulder pressed against his arm, and he brought her books from his library, and listened with evident pleasure as she discussed philosophy and poetry, with an intelligence that society had taught her to hide. And one evening when a thunderstorm swept across the countryside, and Eleanor confessed with embarrassment that she had feared storms since childhood, Alexander simply drew her into his arms and held her while thunder rolled overhead, and she felt safe in a way she had forgotten was possible. And when the storm passed and she looked up at him with gratitude, he kissed her forehead with such tenderness that she understood. His love was not passionate declaration, but rather steady devotion, the kind that would weather all storms. Her mother watched their courtship with joy, tempered by the knowledge that her time was limited, though the physician Alexander had sent reported that she was stronger than she had been in months, and Eleanor suspected that her mother's improvement came not from medicine alone, but from the relief of knowing her daughter would be cared for. And one afternoon, when Alexander had gone to attend to business matters, Eleanor's mother took her hand and said, "He loves you truly, Eleanor. I see it in every glance, and more than that, he respects you, which is rarer and more valuable." And Eleanor nodded because she had come to see this truth herself, that Alexander valued her opinions and her strength rather than merely tolerating them, and this recognition made her love him more deeply than she had thought possible. The gradual thawing of both their guarded hearts happened in increments so small that Eleanor could not point to any single moment of transformation, but rather she woke one morning 3 weeks after their betrothal and realized that she no longer flinched when she heard his footsteps approaching, no longer waited for cruelty or abandonment, no longer doubted that this happiness was real and lasting. And that same day Alexander told her quietly that he had not known he was lonely until he met her, had not understood that his careful construction of an emotionless life was actually a prison until she showed him what freedom felt like. And they stood together in her mother's small garden, surrounded by roses both wild and cultivated, and Eleanor thought that perhaps broken things could indeed be mended, and frozen hearts could indeed learn to feel again, and women judged unworthy by the world could indeed find themselves cherished beyond measure. The wedding took place on a morning in late April, when spring had finally conquered the last remnants of winter, and the small village church was filled with light that streamed through ancient stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor, where Eleanor stood in a gown of simple ivory silk that Alexander had commissioned from London's finest dressmaker. And though the dress bore none of the elaborate embellishments that would have adorned a typical duchess's wedding attire, its elegant simplicity suited Eleanor perfectly, and when she caught sight of herself in the mirror before leaving the cottage, she hardly recognized the woman looking back, for she appeared not merely beautiful but also free, unburdened by shame for the first time in 2 years. Her mother sat in the front pew dressed in new lavender silk that Alexander had also arranged, and though she still appeared fragile, her eyes shone with tears of pure joy as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle, and Eleanor knew that whatever years remained to her mother would be years of peace and happiness rather than anxiety and regret, and this knowledge alone would have made the wedding worthwhile, even without her own profound love for the man waiting at the altar. Alexander had invited only a small gathering of guests, but each invitation had been deliberately chosen to make a statement that Eleanor understood with gratitude, for among the handful of his true friends from university and business stood several women who had themselves been cast out by society's judgment, a baroness who had divorced her abusive husband and lost her social standing in the process, a widow who had borne a child too soon after her husband's death and faced whispered accusations, and a young woman whose engagement had been broken when she refused to marry a man twice her age, and their presence declared that this wedding celebrated not shame's defeat, but rather society's failure to define worth. Eleanor's vows trembled from her lips but remained clear and certain, and she promised to honor and cherish the man who had seen her value when the world insisted she had none. And when Alexander spoke his vows, his voice remained steady until he reached the word cherish, and then it broke slightly, just enough that Eleanor heard the depth of emotion beneath his careful control, and she looked up into his eyes and saw tears threatening to fall, and she realized that this powerful man, who had knelt in the dirt to propose, was now standing before God and witnesses making promises he would guard with his life. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and full of promise, not the passionate embrace of impetuous young lovers, but rather the tender connection of two souls who had found each other across the wreckage of their separate sorrows. And when they drew apart, Alexander whispered so only she could hear, "You are safe now, you are loved, you are mine." And Eleanor whispered back, "And you are mine." And the possessiveness in those words surprised her until she understood that she too had claimed something precious, that marriage was not merely his protection of her but also her acceptance of him. The wedding breakfast took place in Alexander's estate dining room, where he had arranged for Eleanor's favorite dishes and wild roses in every vase. And when he stood to offer a toast, he raised his glass and said in a voice that carried clearly to every guest, "To my wife, whose courage in the face of injustice humbles me, whose grace under persecution inspires me, and whose love transforms me from winter to spring." And Eleanor felt the last frozen places in her heart melt completely as she understood that she was truly safe, truly loved, truly free to begin the life she had thought forever lost to her. The first months of marriage brought Eleanor to London for the season, and though Alexander had assured her repeatedly that she need not face society if she preferred the quiet of the countryside, she understood that avoiding the ton entirely would only confirm their judgment of her as ashamed and unworthy, and so she steeled herself for the ordeal of appearing as the Duchess of Rothwell at precisely the social events that had once celebrated her and then cast her out, and her fear of the first ball manifested in sleepless nights and trembling hands, as her lady's maid dressed her in a gown of deep sapphire silk that Alexander had chosen because he said it matched her eyes. And when she descended the stairs of their London townhouse and saw him waiting in the entrance hall dressed in formal evening attire, the look of fierce pride and protective love on his face gave her courage she had not known she possessed. The ballroom of Lord Pemberton's mansion glittered with candlelight and jewels as Eleanor entered on Alexander's arm, and the immediate hush that fell over the assembled guests confirmed that her arrival had been anticipated as the scandal of the season, and she felt hundreds of eyes assessing her with curiosity and judgment. But Alexander's hand tightened on hers, and he led her directly to the center of the room without hesitation, claiming the first waltz with an authority that brooked no opposition. And as they moved together across the floor, Eleanor could hear the whispers, but also noted that Alexander's public devotion signaled clearly to all observers that she was untouchable, that any slight to the Duchess would be considered a slight to the Duke himself, and this protection allowed her to hold her head high even when Lady Ashworth turned her back deliberately as Eleanor passed, and when the Countess of Somerset offered only the barest acknowledgement required by politeness. Some matrons snubbed her outright, while others approached with thinly veiled curiosity, and Eleanor met each interaction with quiet dignity that neither apologized for her past nor begged for acceptance, and she watched Alexander watch her throughout the evening with such evident pride that she realized he had not brought her to London to prove anything to society, but rather to prove to herself that she could face their judgment and emerge unbroken, and this recognition of his faith in her strength moved her deeply. The season progressed with a mixture of cold shoulders and cautious overtures, and Eleanor discovered that while some doors remained firmly closed, others opened unexpectedly when their hostesses recognized that the Duke's favor could be won through kindness to his wife, and she learned to navigate the treacherous waters of social obligation with grace, born not of desperation for approval, but of genuine indifference to the opinions of those who had judged her harshly. And one afternoon, a young woman named Miss Catherine Winters sought Eleanor's private audience, and with trembling voice admitted that she too had been recently compromised by a gentleman who now refused to acknowledge their understanding. And Eleanor saw in Catherine's frightened eyes her own past reflected, and she offered not merely sympathy but practical assistance, connecting Catherine with a respectable family, seeking a companion, and ensuring her references would not be questioned. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that her pain could indeed be transformed into purpose, that the very experiences that had broken her could now be used to help others whom society had cast aside, and she began quietly to make herself known as a woman who would assist those facing ruin, and this work of redemption gave her a sense of reclaiming not just her own life, but also offering hope to others trapped in similar circumstances, and she understood that she was beginning to reclaim herself, not as the innocent debutante she had once been, but as someone stronger, someone refined by suffering into a woman of genuine compassion and practical wisdom. A year had passed since Eleanor first faced London society as the Duchess of Rothwell, and in that time she had established a quiet salon in the drawing room of their townhouse, where women who found themselves cast out by society's harsh judgments could gather each Thursday afternoon for tea and conversation, and though the gatherings were never announced publicly, and no formal invitations were issued, word spread among those who needed such refuge that the Duchess offered not merely sympathy, but practical assistance in rebuilding shattered lives and reputations, and Eleanor discovered a profound sense of purpose in this work that transformed her own suffering into a gift she could offer others who walked the same painful path she had traveled. Alexander's business partner, Lord Henley, remarked to him one evening at their club that the Winter Duke had thawed considerably in the past year, and Alexander smiled rather than offering his customary cold dismissal, and Henley noted that the Duke now seemed warmer in his dealings, more apt to smile during negotiations, less ruthless in his business practices, though no less successful, and he observed that marriage clearly suited Alexander in ways that surprised all who had known him as the emotionally distant man who had built an empire on ice and calculation, and Alexander accepted these observations with quiet acknowledgement that Eleanor had indeed changed him fundamentally, had drawn him from winter into spring, and taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the foundation of genuine strength. The confrontation Eleanor had half dreaded and half anticipated arrived at the Duchess of Marlborough's autumn ball when she encountered the merchant's son, Thomas Fielding, standing near the refreshment table with his wife, a pinch-faced woman whose dowry had been substantial enough to overcome any concerns about her husband's past indiscretions, and Eleanor felt Alexander tense beside her as Thomas turned and their eyes met, and she could see in Thomas's expression the same casual cruelty that had once devastated her but which now seemed merely pathetic, the posturing of a small man who had mistaken manipulation for power. And when he opened his mouth to speak, Eleanor lifted her hand slightly and said in a voice clear enough to carry to nearby guests, "Mr. Fielding, I must thank you for the service you rendered me some years ago, for in abandoning me you led me directly to my true husband, and I thank God daily that you proved faithless, for had you kept your promises, I would have been trapped in a life of profound unhappiness, with a man of weak character, whereas your betrayal freed me to find genuine love with a man of honor." Thomas's face flushed dark red, and his wife stared at Eleanor with shock, while several nearby guests paused their conversations to observe the exchange. And Thomas sputtered something about Eleanor's impertinence, but Eleanor merely smiled with genuine peace and continued, "I hope your marriage brings you whatever happiness you deserve, sir, and I wish you good evening." And she turned away with Alexander's arm supporting her, and she could feel his fierce love and pride radiating from him as they moved across the ballroom. And she knew from the pressure of his hand on her waist that he understood this moment, marked her complete liberation from the past, her full healing from wounds that had once seemed fatal. And later that night when they returned home, Alexander held her close and told her that watching her face Thomas with such grace and strength had filled him with awe, and Eleanor realized that she was indeed fully healed, fully free, no longer defined by what had been done to her, but rather by what she had chosen to become in spite of it. And the merchant's son who had once held such power to wound her was now nothing more than a distant memory, rendered powerless by the depth of her joy and the security of her love. 5 years had passed since that autumn day when Alexander knelt in the village square, and Eleanor stood now in the gardens of their country estate, watching their 3 children play beneath the ancient oak trees that had witnessed both her deepest despair and her most profound joy, and the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the lawns where their eldest daughter, Catherine, named for the first young woman Eleanor had helped rebuild her life, chased butterflies with the concentrated determination of a 5-year-old, while their twin sons, William and James, barely 3 years old, tumbled together in the grass with shrieks of laughter that carried on the summer breeze. The cottage where Eleanor had once lived in exile with her mother, that small prison of shame and isolation, had been transformed into the headquarters of the Ashford Foundation, a charitable organization that provided shelter, education, and employment assistance to women whom society had cast aside. And Eleanor visited the cottage twice weekly to meet with those seeking help, and each time she walked through its door she remembered the frightened, broken woman she had been and marveled at the mysterious workings of Providence that had turned her greatest wound into her life's purpose. Her mother, healthy and happy beyond anything Eleanor had dared hope during those dark years of illness, lived with them in the main house and spent her mornings in the conservatory, tending exotic orchids, and her afternoons spoiling her grandchildren with the fierce devotion of one who had been granted more time than expected, and she often told Eleanor that watching her daughter's transformation from despair to radiant joy had been worth every moment of suffering they had endured together. Eleanor had set up her easel in the garden's most secluded corner, where wild roses climbed the old stone wall, and she was working on a watercolor of the children playing, when she heard Alexander's voice calling out in mock severity that young gentlemen should not put earthworms in their sister's hair, and she looked up to see her husband, still imposing and handsome, though laugh lines now bracketed his eyes and silver touched his temples, lifting both protesting boys into his arms, while Catherine stood indignantly demanding justice for the assault upon her person. The merchant's son, Thomas Fielding, was nothing more than a distant memory now, a shadow that had lost all power to wound or frighten, and Eleanor had heard through the social networks that still reached her, despite her general withdrawal from London society, that his marriage had dissolved in scandal when his wife's family discovered his gambling debts and numerous infidelities. And while Eleanor felt no pleasure in his downfall, she recognized with quiet satisfaction that the universe had its own way of balancing accounts without her needing to harbor bitterness. She reflected often on the strange and winding path that had brought her from that terrified girl who believed her life was over, to this woman who had found not merely happiness, but genuine fulfillment, and she understood with the clarity that only suffering can teach that her scandal, once her deepest wound and source of unbearable shame, had indeed become the pathway to her greatest blessing, for had Thomas kept his false promises, she would have been trapped in a shallow existence with a man of weak character, whereas his betrayal had freed her to find a love so deep and true that it had transformed not just her circumstances, but her very soul. Alexander set the boys down with a warning to behave, and walked toward Eleanor's easel, and she watched him approach with the same flutter of joy she had felt on their wedding day, and when he reached her side, he studied her painting with genuine appreciation before leaning down to kiss her temple and murmur that she had captured Catherine's fierce spirit perfectly in the tilt of her painted head, and Eleanor set down her brush and turned to embrace him, breathing in the familiar scent of him and feeling the absolute security of his arms around her, and she knew with certainty that she would never cease being grateful for the gift of this man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up rather than walk past. Evening had settled over the estate with that particular quality of summer twilight that turns everything golden and soft, and Alexander found Eleanor sitting alone on the terrace, overlooking the gardens where their children now slept peacefully in the nursery, and he settled beside her on the stone bench and asked quietly what occupied her thoughts, and Eleanor turned to him with eyes that still held traces of the tears she had shed earlier while putting Catherine to bed, tears of gratitude rather than sorrow, and she admitted that she had been remembering that autumn day, 6 years past, when he had knelt in the village square before dozens of witnesses and asked her to be his wife, and she confessed that even now the memory had the power to move her profoundly, for it represented the moment when her life had pivoted from despair toward hope, from isolation toward belonging, from shame toward redemption. Alexander took her hand in his, studying her face in the fading light, and he said with quiet conviction that kneeling before her that day had been the easiest decision of his life, that he had been far more terrified she would refuse than concerned about what society might think. And he told her what he had never quite articulated before, that she had saved him as surely as he had saved her, for before he met her, he had been living a half-life, successful in all material measures, but empty of genuine connection or joy, and she had taught him that true strength required vulnerability, that love demanded courage, that the walls he had built to protect himself had actually imprisoned him. Eleanor leaned against him and felt his arms encircle her with the same protective tenderness he had shown from their earliest days together. And they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead, and she thought about the mysterious workings of providence that had transformed her deepest wound into her greatest blessing. And she understood that without the suffering she would never have developed the compassion that now defined her life's work, would never have appreciated the rarity of genuine love, would never have learned that her worth was not determined by society's judgment, but by her own choices and the quality of her heart. Dear listener, if you find yourself in a season of judgment, if the world has labeled you unworthy or ruined or beyond redemption, know that their assessment is not the final word on your story, for true worth is never determined by the opinions of those who lack the vision to see beneath surfaces or the courage to challenge convention. And remember that love and redemption often come from the most unexpected places, arriving when we have ceased hoping for them, and that the patience to endure suffering and the courage to remain open-hearted despite pain can transform our deepest wounds into sources of wisdom and compassion that bless not only ourselves but all those whose lives we touch. Your darkest moment, the crisis that seems to end all possibility of happiness, might actually be the threshold to your greatest joy, the narrow passage through which you must travel to reach the life you were always meant to live. And though the journey through that darkness feels unbearable in the moment, trust that you are being refined rather than destroyed, shaped rather than broken, prepared for blessings you cannot yet imagine. Hold fast to your dignity, guard your heart without closing it entirely, and believe that somewhere ahead waits the love and acceptance and purpose you were created to receive, and may you find the courage to hope even when hope seems foolish. May you discover that your worth was never diminished by others' cruelty, and may you rest tonight in the peace of knowing that your story is not yet finished, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to believe in it. And may the gentle grace that transformed Eleanor's suffering into purpose and Alexander's isolation into love surround you as well, and guide you toward your own unexpected joy. And if this story has moved you, then please subscribe to Drama Duchess for more tales of love, redemption, and the courage to hope against hope. And may you sleep well tonight knowing that tomorrow holds possibilities you cannot yet see, but which wait patiently for your arrival.